On Middle East affairs. Last week was the second anniversary of the Intifada, the Palestinian uprising against Israel. Where do things stand today?
Well, unfortunately, they stand with the beginning of the third year of the Intifada. Not much changed, except I think a few more people are dying every day. A lot more people are being injured. And I don't think it's going to change until something changes right here in the United States.
Aaron D. Rosenbaum, consultant on international affairs. Do you agree with that assessment?
Not really. I think that what you have here is the Intifada going through a classic pattern that we've observed in Palestinian politics throughout this century. And they are now in the process of consuming themselves with violence and becoming less politically relevant as they try to purify themselves ideologically. So I think that we are seeing a repetition of what occurred in the late 1930s and again in 1947. 48, and with a similarly unacceptable result for the Palestinians, that is the lack of achievement of any Palestinian state.
We're going to open phones in about 10 minutes or so after we learn more about our guests and get a few more items on the table, but you can begin thinking about what you might say, and you can use the phone numbers that appear on the bottom of your screen. We'll go to the phones in a few more minutes. Let's establish a few facts. For example, Mr. Curtis, what is the Intifada? What does the word mean?
Intifada, actually, the people translate it as an uprising. It actually means shaking off.
What language is it?
In Arabic. And the point is, the Palestinians in the occupied areas feel they're shaking off a foreign occupation under which they've lived for 20 years, which was preceded by another foreign occupation for previous 20 years, which was preceded by other foreign occupations over the last 4 centuries. These people have had their first taste of success in their history, because I do disagree with what Mr. Rosenbaum had said. I think the Palestinians have made every mistake in the book over the last few centuries. Fortunately, they've learned from these mistakes. I think the Intifada was quite spontaneous, but they've learned you can't continue a national uprising on pure spontaneity and enthusiasm. They've fallen back on an infrastructure which had been laid down in that area by the PLO over many years.
Mr. Rosenbaum, what particular incident precipitated the Intifada?
Well, the incident that precipitated the Intifada was the death in Gaza, December 8th, I believe, 1987, of an Israeli businessman who was apparently murdered, who had been doing business regularly in Gaza. The next day, I believe, 4 Palestinians were killed in a truck accident, and the rumors went through Gaza, which was the heart of the Intifada, for several months before it really spread actively into the West Bank. Rumors went through Gaza that, in fact, Israeli authorities, the army, was taking revenge, and this sparked a series of repetitive riots, stonings, etc., which expanded into the Intifada. There was, of course, no truth in the claim that, in fact, the Israelis had taken revenge or anything like that, but, in fact, it was the kind of classic tinder spark to ignite tinder that is already there, the sort of things that we've seen in urban riots. And in a sense, it is it fulfills the particular need and paranoia of people who feel that they have been oppressed.
What role does the PLO have in any of this, Mr. Curtis?
Well, I think it has a major role now. I don't think it had a role in the beginning. I think it had to play catch-up, to catch up with this really spontaneous uprising, which was a higher level of violence that had continued for some time, even before December 1987. The PLO certainly has a major role now. There are 3 different elements contending for the leadership. The PLO, Al-Fatah of Yasser Arafat, certainly is in charge. There's particularly in Gaza, there's Hamas, which is an Islamic fundamentalist movement, very uncompromising. And in the West Bank in particular, you have some leftist groups, the old PFLP, DFLP, which I think have pretty much lost their influence in the Intifada. At the moment, Yasser Arafat is calling the shots.
I would disagree with that characterization, if I may.
Well, let me just finish the sentence.
Pardon me.
At the moment, he's calling the shots, and I think, frankly, for the long run, that's very good, because whether we like him or not, Yasser Arafat is the Palestinian, the only Palestinian who has indicated any willingness to make peace. And of course, he's recognized Israel's right to exist, the idea of a two-state solution. I haven't heard that from any of the other Palestinian leaders.
Well, I think that's certainly true, and the question is whether you hear it from the PLO itself. There are a couple of things to consider here. First of all, the PLO was indeed caught unawares, and in fact continues to play catch-up. Second of all, Hamas, an Islamic fundamentalist group of extreme ideological predilections, is not a part of the PLO, and indeed regards the PLO in its own terms as capitulationist and much too liberal, even irreligious, because of its putative willingness to accommodate in any way to Israel. Third, the fact is that the PLO is in a competition in two ways. One, in the West Bank, the DFLP and the PFLP, in fact, are continuing to be active, as one observes in Nablus and in these various committees that are increasingly assaulting Palestinians who are regarded as collaborators, murdering over 100 of those during the life of the Intifada. And finally, the PLO, in a sense, is in competition with the general polity of the West Bank, specifically. The PLO represents an exile leadership which has a desire to restore all of Palestine in the West Bank, Gaza, and what is now Israel. And as such, they are out of touch, both physically and ideologically, with many people in the West Bank who feel themselves separate and feel, in fact, that they have a possibility of reaching an accommodation with Israel. So the PLO, in a sense, is trying to maintain its own ideological extremism and its extreme claim to all of Israel, and is competing against an element in the West Bank especially, which is more moderate and pragmatic by Israeli or American standards.
Mr. Curtis, what has been the United States response to the Intifada, and what do you think, if you don't like it, what it should be?
Well, I think I do like what's happening now, because I think the United States, perhaps the most constructive, and I'd almost say the only constructive thing that was done in the Reagan administration, was at the very end, literally in the last 2 months, we established a dialogue with the PLO. We finally were talking to one of the two parties to the dispute. It's very hard to be an honest broker if you don't speak to one of the parties. That was the legacy that George Bush and James Baker received from the Reagan administration. As you know, Yitzhak Shamir, the Prime Minister of Israel, has done everything possible to break off that dialogue. It didn't work. And as a result, we have the PLO, meaning Yasser Arafat, has made 3 concessions, key concessions. He's recognized Israel's right to exist. He's agreed to UN Security Council Resolution 242, which has been the basis of our Middle East policy through 6 administrations, and he has renounced terrorism. What's happening right now before our eyes is James Baker, our Secretary of State, is trying to get Yitzhak Shamir to make the same 3 concessions. So far, he's made none of them.
Mr. Rosenbaum, your view of policy from the U.S.?
Well, the United States is concentrating on the Palestinian component of the Arab-Israel conflict. I think that's a mistake. The fact is that's the most difficult element, I think we would all concede, in resolving this larger regional conflict. Indeed, on the part of the Arab governments, there has been a movement to localize the conflict, to remove their sense of responsibility for the Arab-Israel conflict, and to focus it only on the Israeli-Palestinian dimension. And the administration, the Bush administration, has bought into that. Frankly, I think that the Bush administration is making a good effort, a good faith effort, and I think that it is worth the endeavor. The problem is that they have stronger cards that they are not playing based on the level of reconciliation and recognition that exists between Israel and a number of Arab governments today, including, of course, not only Egypt, but, for instance, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, to some extent Iraq, Algeria, Morocco, etc. And I think that this would provide a broader base, concentration in that area, rather than on the most difficult objective, the Palestinian-Israeli component.
We're about ready to go to the phones. If you'd like to call, use the phone numbers that appear on the screen. If you're calling from the Eastern or the Central time zones, 202-628-2525 is the number for you to use. Those calling from the Mountain or Pacific time zones, 202-783-2727. And if you're outside this country, dial the appropriate country code and then area code 202-737-6734. This is, well, at least last week was, the 2nd anniversary of the Intifada. That's the subject during this segment, and we're pleased to have with us 2 gentlemen who I think have demonstrated that they have different views on this subject. To my right is Mr. Aaron D. Rosenbaum. He's a consultant on international politics. He currently runs his own consulting firm here in Washington, D.C. He has been featured on other news programs. You may have seen him on the McNeil-Lehrer NewsHour, CNN, NPR. You might have heard him on NPR. He's published articles in newspapers across the country on these issues. He's been a guest lecturer at the Library of Congress, and he spent 8 years from 1972 to 1980 as the Director of Research of the American-Israel Public Affairs Committee, AIPAC. He has an undergraduate degree from the University of Michigan and a graduate degree from Georgetown University in International Relations and Middle Eastern Politics. And opposite the table from him is Mr. Dick Curtis. He's the chief editor of this magazine, the Washington Report on Middle East Affairs. This happens to be the current issue, December 1989. He used to be the chief inspector for the U.S. Information Agency and deputy director for the Near East and South Asia of USIA. He's a retired Foreign Service officer, served in the United States Army from 1944 to 1947. He has a B.A. from the University of Southern California, and he has done graduate work, and I guess leading to a degree, at Georgetown University also, the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies. And assuming that everything I said about you gentlemen is correct, almost, well then we'll get corrections later on as we take the first call. This one from Teaneck, New Jersey. Go ahead, please. You're on the air.
Thank you.
Whoa. Go ahead.
I'd like to ask a question to both the speakers. Obviously, Israel is in a very difficult situation in terms of its security. And the security goes beyond its military forces. It goes to its ability to exist and to continue to exist in a very hostile environment. And we only have to look north 90, 100 miles from Israel to see the results of what happens when those security situations do not exist. My question simply is, it's very nice for Mr. Arafat to talk about 242, to talk about different things, but what other steps do you both feel that Mr. Arafat and the Palestinians should be making to Israel? What other steps should they take to give Israel assurances, as Sadat did, that Israel will continue to exist so that Israel can become a willing partner in a peace negotiation?
Okay, sir. Thank you. Mr. Curtis?
Well, I think that first we have to realize that no treaty is going to guarantee the security of Israel unless it's guaranteed by the Soviet Union, by the United States, by all the members of the United Nations, and I think that's a given in any sort of peace treaty. Yasser Arafat has made some of the concessions. He's agreed to a two-state solution. How to make that stick? Obviously, there are going to be agreements not only on the level of armaments for the Palestinian state, but perhaps even more importantly on sharing of water, because there isn't enough water there for everyone without it being supplemented from outside. These agreements, I think everyone would agree, will have to be internationally supervised. There's going to have to be a very close degree of international monitoring of how this treaty works out in order to keep anyone from having the temptation to cheat. I think the last thing I'd like to say is, I think inevitably and probably very quickly, there will be some economic unions. There's no question that the West Bank state, Palestine, and Jordan would enter into some sort of an agreement quickly because neither is viable by itself. My guess is that there will be a third element in that very shortly, and that will probably be Israel. My guess is that we would have a Benelux-type arrangement, and Yasser Arafat has suggested that himself.
Well, there's no question that, in fact, the economic component is terribly important, and the idea of economic union, in fact, should apply, of course, to Israel, the West Bank, and Jordan as a natural economic relationship that was there for centuries. I have a real problem here with the idea of international guarantees, because international guarantees are no real assurance that a treaty will, in fact, stay intact. Too much in the century we have seen the decline of international guarantees at the time of crisis. Israel has direct experience with this, of course, in 1967 with the putative guarantees it had of freedom of passage through the Straits of Tiran, and of course other guarantees as well. What you need, rather, is a Nicholsonian agreement in which the responsibilities, as Harold Nicholson, the British diplomat and diarist, pointed out, the responsibilities of both parties are so unambiguous that the performance of the treaty is guaranteed essentially in advance. For that to occur, there has to be a transformation of the Palestinians and the PLO, because at this point they are still operating on the assumption that they can achieve what they call the two-stage theory. First, to push Israel back to the 67 borders, and then to use that as a base for driving Israel back to the 47 borders and out of existence. And indeed, this was articulated clearly, not by Arafat in his pledge a year ago, but rather by the PLO a few weeks thereafter. And this is something that we have to deal with, this in continuing duplicitousness, and I think, frankly, a sense of self-deception on the part of the PLO.
Bucks County, Pennsylvania is next. Good morning.
Yes, good morning. Gentlemen, as far as I'm concerned, as an American taxpayer, I am terribly ashamed, and of course it's against the morals and the religious beliefs of most Americans, as far as I'm concerned, to have these Semitic children as young as 3-year-olds shot and killed and beaten daily with our tax billions. These billions, of course, are sorely needed for American programs.
This is an excuse me, sir, this is an oversimplification. And I think what you're doing is you're repeating a kind of classic misrepresentation of the nature of aid to Israel. In fact, the fact is that the United States supports Israel economically because of, first of all, moral reasons aside from anything else. And the fact is that Israel, as a democracy that shares our values in a region in which those values are not seen, establishes itself as an ally whose strategic value then becomes more apparent and flows from that.
World and not be totally hypocritical. How do you align these with American values? Please answer those questions directly, if you will. Thank you.
I'd like to get into this because I certainly agree with the premise of the caller's question. I'm certain that the U.S. support for Israel initially had moral grounds. We felt that these were people truly in danger of being pushed into the sea, whether or not they were. Doesn't matter. That was the reason we went into this. But I'm afraid the morality has shifted now. We're paying $3 billion a year to Israel. It's being misused. It's being used in contradiction to our own laws. Our military aid, our weapons go to Israel for defensive purposes. They're not defending their own territory in the West Bank and Gaza. What they're doing to a people of whom they've deprived all rights is
that's not an acceptable, characterization.
Well,
let's keep this as a responsible discussion. To
I
deprive them of all their rights, let's consider
I'm not interrupting you either.
Let's consider the circumstances of Arabs who live, for instance, in Jordan, who in a similar situation were greeted with open blasts of gunfire repeatedly. The fact is that what you have in the West Bank and Gaza is still an enlightened occupation compared to what is the rule of autocracy that obtains throughout the Middle East. And what's curious now, in fact, and something we really should discuss, is why, in a circumstance when the walls of totalitarianism are crumbling throughout the world, why the Arab world remains an area which is utterly unresponsive to the call of democracy or of regime democracy or of legitimately derived power. And this is the underlying issue that you're not coming to grips with here. Let's not be cute about this.
I'm not being cute. I'm trying to finish a sentence, and I'd like to finish it without being interrupted. Our aid is being used to perpetuate a military occupation of the Palestinians. I think most Americans, I'm sure any public opinion survey will bear this out, most Americans have shifted their sympathies. They see who is David, they see who is Goliath. They understand that the Palestinians have no representation of any kind. Their situation is not too different from that of the American colonists at the time of our American Revolution. I don't think Americans want to be on the side of perpetual military occupation. If the Israelis were working toward one of two goals, total withdrawal, which makes sense, but under circumstances that will preserve their security, or incorporating these people as well as these territories into the Israeli body politic and giving them rights, the same rights that Jewish residents of Israel have, Americans could understand this. But what we are doing is perpetuating an endless military occupation, which is doing Israel no good either.
All right, we'll go back to the phones. Burlingame, California, good morning.
Yes, good morning.
You're on the air, sir.
I'm calling to make a kind of a general statement and ask a question, Mr. Curtis. And the situation goes like this. If you look at the history of the Middle East conflict in terms of the division among all the Arab states and the way they're handling the feuds among themselves, you begin to think and to realize that it's very difficult for them to get any kind of consensus of what they want. And consequently, any agreement that will be reached supposedly between Israel and any other faction, whether it's the PLO and the other fragmentation of the Arab nationalistic movement, could not be really something that you can trust. In other words, Israel is looking for security for its border, for the citizens, and they are willing, and there's a movement in Israel, obviously, to have a peaceful solution. And I think that we have to understand that Israel is interested in the peace element.
Caller, what's your question?
The question goes like this. What assurances for Israel's security, based on the tremendous conflict and the lack of trust, could the PLO or any other Arab element give Israel? Because if Israel could get that security, an ironclad security for its borders and for its citizens, I think they'll be willing to settle this issue once and for all.
Thank you. Dick Curtis.
Well, I agree. I agree with the question. I agree with your last statement. And in fact, I think the only long-range security for Israel is reaching peace with its neighbors. But as I said earlier, I think we both agreed on this, there have to be international guarantees. This is a situation where if either side is left unfettered, if it's given complete carte blanche, the extremists are going to take over and there are going to be violations of the treaty. I think we see this in our aid to Israel now because we don't put strings on our aid to Israel. We've seen a drift to the right and now maybe a rush to the right in Israeli politics that I think half of the Israeli population deplores as much as I do. There have to be international guarantees. No treaty will work without it.
Aaron Rosenbaum.
Well, I think that, in fact, we've had representations by Mr. Curtis about public opinion in Israel and public opinion in the United States that aren't, in fact, in touch with what those public opinions do, in fact, tell those people who survey them. It's clear that American support for Israel, the underlying visceral support for Israel, remains strong. It's also true that the American people have become concerned about the Intifada and about Palestinian aspirations as well. They should. I think the real problem here is a continuing frustration with the PLO and with the Palestinians of the West Bank. With the PLO in terms of its gamesmanship, siyasa, as we say in Arabic, politics, which really does carry with it in Arabic the connotation of gamesmanship. And among those of the West Bank and Gaza, a kind of pusillanimity, a kind of lack of courage to stand up to the extremists among them, those people who, to this day, as a matter of fact, are trying to define an ever more extreme definition of what constitutes Palestinian nationalism. The American people and the Israeli people are reacting away from what they see as a Palestinian refusal to follow the most elemental forms of pragmatism. And it's clear, conscious of the historical lessons of this century with regard to Jewish survival, that neither the Israeli people nor the American people are about to risk Israel's security on the say-so or promises of people like Yasser Arafat. This has to be supported not only by international guarantees, but in fact by concrete arrangements and by indications that just as there exists within Israel today a strong sympathy for Palestinian national aspirations, there must exist its counterpart among the Palestinians, which is, in a sense, a Palestinian Zionism. And that is an asymmetrical situation that has not been remedied. Until the Palestinians remedy it, there is no real movement toward peace.
Gentlemen, our next call is from Malmo, Sweden. Go ahead, please.
Yes, good afternoon. I'm calling from Malmo, Sweden. I'm listening to your program. I have a question that how long Israelis, they can afford to misuse American aid because it seems to me that not itself Israeli, but they are spoiling American position and their policies all over the world. And now nobody regards Americans, as before, because their attitudes towards, Israelis, towards those Palestinians living on Gaza and all those places, it shows that they are terrorists, Israelis, not those Palestinians, because they are using everything, everything to crush humanity. This is my question,
Okay, sir. Thank you. So why don't we start with Mr. Curtis?
Well, I agree with you. That's why I'm sitting here, because I've seen the prestige of the United States go down, not just in the Arab world, certainly in the entire Islamic world, and certainly in Europe, because I think at this point people really don't understand why the United States doesn't put some kind of strings on its aid to Israel. The string that I would advocate would be that the United States would deduct $1 from its aid to Israel for every dollar the Israelis spend on Jewish settlements in the West Bank and Gaza. Every administration that since the settlements began, has agreed that they were an impediment to peace. All but one, all but Ronald Reagan's administration has also said they're illegal. Yet we go on putting a lot of money into Israel, which makes continued settlement possible, which makes it more difficult for the Israelis to finally withdraw from these lands that our 6 administrations in a row have said go back to the Israelis. I think we've got to start putting strings on this aid. I think it will be a great help, not merely to our standing in the world. I think it will be a great help to the moderates and the peace groups in Israel.
Well, I clearly disagree with that characterization. I don't think it's politically realistic, nor do I think it's in touch with what are the realities, not only in this town, but of course in the region. Aid to Israel operates at several levels. First of all, Israel, in fact, is an inexpensive investment because it has de facto acted as a buttress for NATO's position in the Eastern Mediterranean, and has acted to reinforce the Turkish and Greek position there against what until a few weeks ago was a Soviet threat. Second of all, Israel in fact deserves aid because the aid is essential for Israel to maintain its circumstance in its own situation, surrounded by Arab adversaries who, while some of them may be on a pragmatic basis rather politically moderate, on an ideological basis find it difficult to resist potential pan-Arab pushes when push comes to shove against Israel. And we see, for instance, the Saudis, even the Jordanians, the Iraqis, certainly the Syrians posing a continuing threat to Israel. Israel needs that aid because while the Syrians and the Saudis and the Iraqis have been able to purchase these things or get aid from a variety of sources, Israel can only look to itself and to the United States. I think the real argument here that I reject is the idea that American prestige has declined. We've been hearing this from the Department of State since the late 1940s, read Foreign Relations of the United States. It's never been, in fact, the case. In fact, American influence diplomatically is high because the United States is always perceived as being able to deal with all sides of any conflict and to be a fair broker. The fact is that the Soviet Union can't play that role because it has no relations with Israel. And the fact is that the Europeans can't play that role because they can't guarantee any kind of settlement. The United States, in fact, has the relationship with Israel perceived throughout the world as the litmus test of its general commitments abroad. And if we weaken that relationship, we undermine our image throughout the world. It would be to damage Israel that we would damage ourselves.
We've got less than a quarter hour to go with both of our guests, and the next call is from New York City. Go ahead, please. New York City, you're on the air. New York City.
Hello?
Yes, ma'am. Go right ahead.
Yes, I am on the air.
Yes,
I
and
have
please
so
turn
many
down the
damn
volume of your television set, please, so we don't get the feedback.
No sense at all.
All right.
I guess, I've been up since Krauthammer, which was rebroadcast here about 4 in the morning.
Mm-hmm.
And I was not really pleased with what he had to say. But what I regard as the absolute corruption between this country and Israel is AIPAC. And that fellow's there. And, how dare he carry on the way he does? I mean,
you're talking about Mr. Rosenbaum, I take it, because we mentioned that he was for 8 years director of research for AIPAC.
I don't care. I mean, he's part of that group. And what I'm saying, you know, the moment one raises one's voice, and I'm clearly an old damn wasp from the sound of me, is the whole bit about if you speak a word against Israel, you are ipso facto anti-Semitic, which is absolute rubbish. I mean, it's such rubbish I can't even go on with it.
All right.
And I've heard that anyway. I mean, after all, Seymour Hersh is the one who wrote in the Atlantic about the firing on the Liberty. We know now that there have been spies in this country that have come from Israel. We know now that treaties were abrogated when they went into the Lebanon, and they have used American military equipment, which was only given to them under treaty, to defend Israel.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you. I think we've got enough on the table for Mr. Rosenbaum to respond to.
Well, I want to congratulate her, first of all, on her graduation from the famous non sequitur observers of political science school. I think that there are a remarkable series of irrelevancies here. Let me try to find the relevant points. First relevant point is that, in fact, Israel has not violated meaningfully the conditions under which it has received weapons, or indeed violated meaningfully any of its understandings with the United States. In fact, Israel's definition of defense and defensive need has to be broader, and the members of Congress have consistently supported that interpretation because they understand that Israel is in a most parlous and difficult situation in terms of its security needs. In terms of AIPAC, AIPAC is in fact a reflection of the U.S. Constitution, which guarantees people the right to petition their government. AIPAC is open. I've been a member of AIPAC, but I've worked for AIPAC for 9 years and more. I admire the organization very much because I think that it reflects the position not only of the Jewish community, but of the vast majority of American people who support a strong U.S.-Israel relationship. And in fact, AIPAC and supporters of Israel utilize precisely the same lobbying tools available to all Americans on any particular issue of interest to them. And in fact, it is implicitly anti-Semitic to suggest that this somehow sinister lobby, in this woman's view, somehow exercises greater dominance over foreign policy. No one exercises dominance over Congress. Congress does not want to yield as a reflection of what it regards as a public opinion of the American people. And in fact, AIPAC has simply reinforced the natural predilection of Americans to support democracies.
As long as we're talking about backgrounds, Mr. Curtis, why don't you give us a sentence or two about your magazine, The Washington Report on Middle Eastern Affairs, and in the course of it, tell me who the American Educational Trust is.
Well, the Washington Report on Middle East Affairs is the major activity of the American Educational Trust. We published the magazine for 6 years. We've just been talking about AIPAC. We're about to bring out a book called Stealth Pacts, which describes exactly how AIPAC has dominated Congress on Middle Eastern questions. And it explains that in the course of the last 14 years, 124 political action committees, pro-Israel political action committees, have been established, of which at any given time 70 to 80 are active.
Before you go off on that tack, how many subscribers do you have? What's the readership, and what is its general editorial thrust?
We have a press run of 30,000. About half of it goes to subscribers. The rest is on newsstands, goes to group memberships and so forth. We don't concentrate, obviously, only on the Arab-Israeli dispute, but it certainly is the question that our readers are most interested in. But we cover the entire Islamic world, particularly the Arab states.
Okay, we'll go back to the phones. We've got less than 10 minutes to go. Los Angeles, California. Go ahead, please. You're on the air.
Yeah, but people don't realize it. That in 1948, there was created by the United Nations the partition of Israel. And Israel accepted it. The Palestinians wouldn't accept it. And they say, we want all or nothing. We want to drive the Israelis into the sea. No, they created the 1948 war, and the Palestinians lost. One of my questions is, should California be back to the Mexicans? Should we give New Mexico back? Well, that idea is that if Israel will be occupied by the West Bank, there's a stretch of 8 miles where Israel could be strangled if the West Bank becomes an Israeli state. And number 3, please, let me finish that. The Arafat and the PLO was created by the Arabs as a political football in order to exterminate And that is the reason why Israel doesn't want to negotiate with somebody who wants to exterminate Israel. And my last thing is, please, is the stone throwers are children. Are the Palestinians coward enough that the fathers don't want to throw the stones?
Okay, sir, thank you. Who wants to take it first?
I'd like to take just the points. I think that we always set two standards. We ask Arafat to explain everything he's ever said. We ask him to keep making new pledges, new concessions. We ask nothing of the Israelis. The Israelis haven't even come up. Yitzhak Shamir has not even come up with the three statements that Yasser Arafat made to us over a year ago. There certainly will be no security without international guarantees. No one contests that. As for using children to throw stones, I think it's a matter of history that if an adult gets out and throws a stone, he gets shot between the eyes and he gets shot by a sniper. The children are still being shot, but if a man is seen out doing this sort of thing, he's lucky if he gets to the police station alive. He goes into detention for 1 year, no due process of law. There's no one left to throw the stones but the children.
Obviously, I think we've been through this already. I think the questioner raised very useful points about the track record of the Palestinians and Arafat. I would simply ask a simple point here. If the PLO is concerned with the liberation of the West Bank and Gaza, and those are its sole concerns, how was it that when it was formed in 1964, 3 years before the West Bank and Gaza were under Israeli occupation, it was named the Palestine Liberation Organization? And indeed, what Palestine is it intent upon liberating? In fact, I think the PLO remains committed to its historical goal of the demise of Israel.
Kearney, New Jersey, good morning.
Yes, I have an open question, but I guess I'd address it to both the gentlemen. Mr. Curtis, you talk of representation. Have the Palestinians and the PLO elected representation, or have they ever attempted to elect any?
They have the Palestine National Council. The last meeting of the entire council was on television. It was in Amman. It was broadcast into Israel. Every Palestinian, every Israeli could see it on his television set. That's about as open an election as you can have, and quite in a way, it will set the pace when they get their state. It will set the pace for democracy in many of the other Arab states. There's no question in my mind, there's no question in any survey that you take of Palestinians, whether it's in the West Bank, whether it's in the Gulf, whether it's in Washington, D.C., that the PLO is the Palestinian government. Yasser Arafat is their chief of state. He's the only man who can make peace. We're very lucky that he's the only Palestinian who's indicated he's willing to make peace. He's recognized Israel's right to exist. He's asking the same recognition from the Israelis for the Palestinians.
Caller, quickly, did you have another question for Mr. Rosenbaum? I guess he didn't, in which case I'd like to squeeze this in before we run out of time, sir. West Germany, Krefeld, West Germany?
Yes, good afternoon. Sir, first I'd like to address this question to Mr. Rosenbaum, and my question is, what do you expect of the PLO to do? I mean, they have offered different treaties or different solutions which Israel did not accept. What do you think they should do now?
I think the PLO. Thank you. I think the PLO has to recognize that the onus of responsibility is on the Palestinians and on the PLO, given the historic record of both the Palestinians and the PLO. It is important for the PLO to demonstrate that, in fact, they have undergone a political transformation. Despite what Mr. Curtis has suggested, the PLO really, while certainly recognized legitimately on the part of the Palestinians as their representative, in fact, is not elected. In fact, is a classic association of contending power groups. And indeed, what we have observed in Lebanon, in fact, would go on exactly as we have seen it in Lebanon, in the West Bank, were a Palestinian state to be established there under the PLO, as forces would contend. Similarly, the Palestinians have not demonstrated in the interviews that people have with Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, let alone those outside the territories, demonstrated the Palestinians have not, as a people or really as individuals, moved towards an accommodation with the right of Israel to exist as a Jewish state permanently in peace in the region. And they have to, in a sense, as I suggested before, demonstrate this by showing what is the counterpart of what already exists in Israel. There is strong empathy within among Israelis for Arab nationalism and Palestinian aspirations. There is no, I repeat, no meaningful Palestinian Zionism, recognition of the justice of the Jewish claim to a state in Israel. And until they have demonstrated that, until they are willing to make commitments on that basis, I think the Israelis are wise, given the 2,000 years of Jewish history that have just passed, to insist upon performance before they put their necks on the line.
In the time left to us, let me ask each of you, starting with Mr. Curtis, what is the future of the Intifada? How long will this go on?
This is the independent struggle for the Palestinians. It will go on until they get independence. They've thrown everything on this throw of the dice. They're suffering terribly. They're suffering terribly because of our aid to Israel, which enables this repression to go on. The suffering will go on until we blow the whistle. The suffering will go on until they get their independence. I'd like to just point out, because I think Mr. Rosenbaum just stood truth on its head here, the Palestinians have recognized Israel's right to a state in that land. It's Israel that has not recognized the Palestinian right. It's not a question of a contest between two rights. One side has recognized the right of the other. It's up to us to ask the Israelis to make only the same concessions now that the Palestinians made over a year ago.
Half a minute, Mr. Rosenbaum. What's the future of the Intifada?
The Intifada is going the same way as the Palestinian revolts of the 1920s, of 1936 through 39, 1947, 48. In fact, it is moving towards political irrelevancy, ideological extremism, violence, and I think that this is unfortunate. The opportunity for accommodation between the two communities exists, but it will require a change among the Palestinian people first.
Thank you both, Mr. Dick Curtis, Chief Editor of the Washington Report on Middle East Affairs, and Mr. Aaron D. Rosenbaum, formerly of AIPAC, currently a consultant on international politics. We appreciate your time this morning. We're going to continue discussion, this time on a different subject, and that will be defense spending. Some people think that we can cut the defense spending in half very quickly, and to talk with us about that will be David Rosenbaum, the chief economic correspondent of the New York Times, and we'll be back with him in just a few minutes.
Good morning from the nation's capital. You're watching C-SPAN. We'd like to take a short break now to bring you an update of our program schedule for the next several hours. But first, this reminder, on Sunday evening at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, we'll air a speech by Secretary of Agriculture Clayton Yiter. He addresses members of the National Press Club. Now here's a look ahead at our program schedule. Coming up in just a few moments, join us for a live call-in program focusing on defense spending. Our guest is David Rosenbaum of the New York Times. Then at 9:30 a.m. Eastern Time, 6:30 on the West Coast, we'll bring you coverage of a forum focusing on the media and the Middle East. The discussion is sponsored by the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Following that, stay with us for live coverage of a state federal assembly held by the National Conference of State Legislatures. National drug control policy is the focus of the first afternoon session. Then participants will discuss the death penalty. Later in the evening, the topic turns to environmental issues. Our guest for the 6:30 p.m. live viewer call-in program is Michael DeLon, the White House Counsel on Environmental Quality. After that, we continue our discussion on the environment. We'll talk to Sharon Newsom of the National Wildlife Federation, Steve Hellam of the National Environmental Development Association, and Scott Bush, representing the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Finally, at 11 p.m. Eastern Time, it's coverage of the tree lighting ceremony at the Ellipse behind the White House. And that's a look ahead at our schedule. Thanks for watching C-SPAN.
Wednesday on C-SPAN, Douglas Wilder is our guest, the first black elected governor in the United States. He'll answer your questions on Virginia state and national politics. That's Wednesday, 8 a.m. Eastern Time, 5 a.m. Pacific.
At the end of each week, the top news stories are reviewed by a group of journalists and C-SPAN viewers. Tune in for a re-air of the Journalists' Roundtable, Saturdays at 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific Time. Book Notes, weekly interviews with authors writing about issues of interest to our public affairs audience. Sundays on C-SPAN. beginning at 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific Time.